breaking news. The numbers are in, and we have the winners and losers of 2023. What gear is most used by you? And some of it's pretty shocking. We have leaked cameras from Canon, Sony, and Nikon. All of that and more. But first, I want to thank our sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace is your real home on the web. You see, social media makes money from you, but you can make money from your Squarespace website. That's where you host your business website, your photography portfolio, your video reel, or even just a website for whatever personal project you have. I think I have 5 or 6 Squarespace websites for different things that I have going on because, you know why? Somebody else owns social media. Start at squarespace.com/Tony and you'll create something that you own. A custom domain, your own email addresses, a store, whatever you can imagine. Start at squarespace.com/Tony, get a free trial, no credit card required. And after you love it, the coupon code Tony gets you 10% off. Thanks for supporting us and continuing to support us in 2024. You might have noticed we're updating our branding. Our YouTube logo is changing. We have some colors. We're trying to be consistent in the fonts and colors that we use in things like slides and our logos. We're the same. It's just for literally the last 11 years on YouTube, we've been using the default fonts on Keynote and in Final Cut, literally the default fonts and colors for more than a decade. And we've just decided to try to be more like every successful YouTuber and have some amount of branding. So just be on the lookout. We're going to look a little bit different now. I've also wanted to ask if you want us to bring back the live show. We used to do a live show where we reviewed photos every Thursday at 5, and Chelsea and I talk about it all the time, and we never seem to do it. But write a comment if you want to see that, and maybe we'll start it up again and do it weekly, even if we have to move it to a separate channel. Something interesting happens at the end of every year. LensRentals, one of the biggest rental agencies, releases their list of the most popular gear. And it gives us a good metric on what people are actually using. Because we're always like reviewing the latest and greatest stuff, but that's not necessarily what's actually in the field. So I wanted to take a look at some of their results. First up is their list of most rented gear. And that is not by dollar value, but this is by actual quantity of things rented. And when I look at this list, I'm shocked by how much of this is Canon. People want that 24-70, but it doesn't say RF, like they're renting the DSLR, the old EF 24-70, but they're renting the new RF 70-200. They're renting our 5s and our 6s, but also in close third behind those, the 5D Mark IV DSLR. Still a lot of Sony gear being used, but a lot of people getting A7S IIIs, maybe just because they need video for one weekend or something and they don't need it in their daily pack. It's also interesting to look at the overall camera brand market share. This is for camera bodies being rented. And the changes from last year. You can see Canon still in first place, but they dropped by 7%. And Sony is now really close behind, less than 1% behind. And maybe more importantly, Sony is gaining. They're moving in the right direction. This is weird because LensRentals sorted by 2022 numbers instead of 2023 numbers, but we can see Nikon passed Blackmagic. But Nikon is still in like a distant third. And that really highlights the amount of struggle that Nikon has had moving from the DSLR world into the mirrorless world. And then everybody else is kind of an also ran, like Panasonic, Leica. There's no Olympus even named. More people are renting GoPros than are renting OM cameras. And what is Bird Dog? I've literally never heard of Bird Dog, and I'm in the industry. Now what about the lenses rented? I think this more accurately represents the people who own some part of a system but need specialty lenses, whereas the cameras being rented, people might not have cameras at all. And here, Canon really dominates. That's because Canon has been number one for a long time. And you can look at what new cameras are being sold, but that doesn't count the millions and millions of people who bought their Canon gear 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, and still are using it. So you can see Canon has almost twice the number of lenses rented compared to number 2, which is Sony. Canon still dominates the market, and it's important to remember that, especially when you're reviewing new gear. But Sony, again, continues to gain. Sigma rents a lot of lenses, almost 4 times more than Tamron. That really surprised me. And again, Nikon is in a distant third, and everybody else kind of also rans. Now, if you look at the actual lens mounts, it's interesting to see that more people are renting Canon DSLR lenses than Canon mirrorless lenses. Mirrorless still is not most of the market, even though it's been 4 or 5 years since Canon launched their mirrorless system. More people are continuing to shoot with cameras like the 5D series of DSLR cameras. This is especially true with Nikon, where almost twice as many people are renting Nikon DSLR lenses compared to mirrorless lenses. Nikon has had a particularly hard time transitioning people from DSLR to mirrorless, and in fact, based on our research, a lot of Nikon DSLR shooters actually transitioned to Sony or Canon mirrorless and away from the Nikon lineup completely. Now, Nikon stumbled when they first went mirrorless. Now I think they've caught up. So hopefully they can retain some of that market share as those last remaining people transition to mirrorless. Here you can see the micro four thirds market continues to decline pretty steeply. L mount increasing, but still even a fraction of micro four thirds. L mount just has not seen the traction we'd want to see for a system that's going to thrive. Now let's talk about the Canon R3 Mark II as leaked by CanonRumors.com. They're saying it's going to come in 2025, which is really far out, and that it'll probably have a global shutter. And there's not much more information, but I do want to hazard a couple of guesses. I'm guessing the R3 Mark II will have the same body as the R3 that I'm filming this on. But I'm also going to guess that Canon's going to drop the eye tracking thing because honestly, it sucked when it was in my Canon Elan 2E like 27 years ago when I bought that first SLR, and it still sucked in the R3. I used it like 3 times and then stopped, so I think they can drop it. I bet it'll still be 24 megapixels because it's mostly a sports camera, and that's fine for sports cameras, but I bet they're going to go crazy with the frames per second and try to outdo the A9 Mark III and give it like 200 frames per second. After all, if it's coming out a year later, they have to one-up it somehow, and I do bet that that's what Canon will launch their global shutter with instead of the R1. Canon always goes high with the prices because, as we just established, they still dominate the market, so I bet it'll be about $6,500. But I have a request. Canon, please, can we stop just chasing numbers? Since the 50s, you have been like one-upping everybody with the frames per second, with the shutter speed, and we're done. We're there. We have reached the limits of what is practical and useful. When it was the 1964 Olympics and you had 7 frames per second instead of 5 on your film winder, that was great. That made a practical difference. But I don't need to be seeing 1,000 frames per second. Okay, the A9 Mark III, man, I tested it. I was excited about the 120 frames per second, and then you know what? I was annoyed by it when I got back to my computer. It's like too much. Any amount of improvement is so subtle that it's kind of offset by the workflow problem. So please, can we just recenter? Like, you did it. You did it. You can rest. You got all the frames per second. Your shutters, it's so fast. It's already, the stack shutter is so, we don't need more. You know what I could use? A screen I can see in sunlight. Is that asking too much? It's cool that you can detect birds and trains and the Roomba rolling around on the floor, but I'm tired of having to go in and manually select it from a list. If you're so smart, you figure out if I'm pointing the camera at a bird or a person and just focus on that, because what we need is more simplicity, not more stupid menu items. Also, now that you can see subjects, this is a sports camera, right? Don't make me dial in the shutter. Why don't you pick a shutter speed that freezes the motion of whatever I'm photographing and allow me to dial in the amount of motion. That way, if somebody is sprinting really fast to catch the football, you'll give me a shutter speed of 1/4,000th of a second. And if they're taking a break and celebrating, you'll give me a shutter speed of 1/500th. Gather a little more light, improve the image quality. Humans can't react that fast, but your cameras can. Let's be a little smarter about it. And how about some internal storage? Because even CF Express Type B cards are really slow compared to something like M2 NVMe cards. You could pretty much completely eliminate buffering. You would eliminate people forgetting their memory cards. Give me internal storage plus 1 external memory card, kind of like Hasselblad does. That way I can maintain my current workflow. I can have a backup, but I'm not bottlenecked by memory card speeds. Also, a few years back, you released Image.Canon, which promised to take the pictures from the camera and wirelessly transfer it directly from the camera to your servers and then over to Lightroom Cloud or Google Drive or my computer. And it never worked well. It never worked well. It always sucked. It would work for a little bit and then it would leave me hanging. Could you just please make that work before you go into like super fast readout speeds and such? And can we just reboot the entire user interface? Because your menu system still seems pretty much the same as your first DSLR. Wipe it. Let's just start over. Let's eliminate almost all those options. The R3's manual is 1,000 pages long. That's too much. It's too hard for people to use. Give me a menu system like my phone and let me search it. Next up, NikonRumors.com leaks specs for the upcoming Nikon Z6 Mark III. In fact, they say some photography influencers are over in Japan reviewing the camera right now. These are the specs that we can expect to see. It's going to be 24 megapixels with an ISO range from 100 to 64,000, all very typical. It'll have 9 different subjects that it can autofocus on, much like the Z8 and Z9. This is new. It'll record 6K at 30 frames per second or 4K at 120 frames per second, supporting both N-Log and HLG internally. That'll just expand the dynamic range of video. It will not have N-RAW though, which is Nikon's RAW format. Like the Z8, but not like the Z6 Mark II, it'll have a CF Express Type B card and an SD card, and that CF Express Type B card gives us a clue that it's probably going to be supporting higher frame rates, or maybe that 4K 120 needs that extra bandwidth from the higher speed memory card. They're going to be offering a form of pixel shift, which in every camera I've ever tested is completely useless, so who cares? And it's going to have some better cooling, which it probably needs if it's going to be recording at really high frame rates. My personal wishes for the Nikon Z6 Mark III, this is a consumer camera, and consumers no longer buy cameras. You have lost about 95 to 97% of that market share over the last decade. And guess what? It's not because people want 6K. They don't care about that. They don't care about high frames per second. People want something they don't have to read the whole manual for, and they want pictures that can be easily shared. They want computational photography. These are the things that we need to be seeing in mid-range consumer-grade cameras if you want to improve your market share, if you want to appeal to a larger audience than people who already own your cameras. Just like Canon, give me a screen I can see, give me internal storage, make SnapBridge work. When you promise to automatically transfer the pictures to my phone in the background, I love that idea. It never worked reliably. Can you please, just please make that work and learn a lesson from the success of the ZF and the ZFC, and you can make it attractive. Cameras don't have to just be black. Okay, my guess is that what we'll actually see as opposed to what I want, I think we'll actually get a flippy screen. I think we'll get 20 frames per second. I think this will pretty much be a Nikon ZF, but in a more function over form body instead of a design first body. And I think they'll up the frames per second. So it's probably 20 frames per second, probably something like that. I think they want to compete with the R8, but with 2 memory cards, a little more pro take on Canon's R8. And I think they'll probably market it as a vlogging camera, even though I've never found a Nikon that was particularly good at that particular task. I'm going to guess the price under $2K, either $18.99 or $19.99. SonyAlphaRumors leaked the upcoming Sony a7S IV, and we use the a7S III in all of our out-of-the-studio productions. It's a fantastic video camera with some flaws that I would love to see fixed. These rumored specs, which aren't especially solid, are saying that it's going to have a 20 megapixel stacked sensor, but not a global shutter. And that kind of surprises me because the shutter from the A9 Mark III I think would be perfect for the next generation of A7S, but maybe it's just a little too expensive. They're saying the frame rates are going to be 6K at 120 frames per second, so it'll basically be doing a full readout from that 20 megapixel sensor, or 4K at 120 frames per second over sample. Now, the current A7S III is 12 megapixels, and when you read out 4K video, that means it's doing a 1-to-1 readout, which means it's very efficient. It doesn't need any computation. It just dumps it out to the card. But there's a reason in the studio here I use the Canon R3, because it is oversampled, and oversampling from 6K does produce better images. So I think that extra oversampling will produce better 4K video, which is what most people are going to be shooting. Like the A7S III, it'll have IBIS as well as software-based active stabilization, which probably still won't work very well. They're saying it's going to have a better electronic viewfinder and screen. If there's a screen I can see in the sunlight, that would mean Sony has actually been listening to my pleas for the last decade. They're also going to improve the ergonomics. I would bet it has the same shape grip as the A9 Mark III, and it'll have some new cooling in it to handle all that extra processing that it's doing. And they're saying the price will be about $4,000, and that makes sense to me. My own personal wish list for the A7S IV, if you're listening, Sony, is can you let me scrub through videos? Because you give me little VCR controls now, but after I record something, I need to make sure it's in focus, that I have sound, and you make that really hard to like check the beginning and end of the video. I need the auto exposure to be stable. Right now, if I leave auto exposure on, it's like up and down, even though my face is steady. And I kind of need auto exposure because light conditions change and I'm in front of the camera, but auto exposure doesn't work. So I end up manually setting exposure, which is difficult to do when you're setting up the camera, but you're also on camera. Like, how do you control the settings when you need to be 10 feet away from the camera and auto expose for your own face? I need not aperture priority, but depth of field priority. If I hold something up close to the camera, the depth of field gets very thin. I want shallow depth of field when I'm focused away on something the size of a human, but when I hold a camera up to the camera, go ahead and increase the f-stop so I still have a reasonable amount of depth of field, because depth of field varies based on distance. Back that out and give me a consistent depth of field regardless of changing subject distance. Give me internal storage. Let me sync to my phone or to the internet transparently, because you know what? Right now I use my iPhone for a lot of B-roll when we're producing something and, oh, I need to add a shot of this. I'll go grab it with my iPhone just so I can airdrop it to my computer. It's such a pain to always be shuffling around the tiny floppy disk that they force us to use. It's antiquated. Something I learned that I needed from the DJI Pocket 3 is internal wireless. With the DJI Pocket 3, I can snap a mic on here with no receiver because the receiver for the wireless mic is internal, and that's in a $500 pocket-sized camera. Sony makes wireless mics, so why don't you just build that wireless receiver right into the camera and save the extra wires? And while you're at it, give me wireless monitoring headphones that I can monitor in real time, because I have broken cameras because I was monitoring sound with wired headphones and I forgot I had them on and I walked away and I dragged the whole tripod down. It's 2024, almost. Let's get rid of all the wires. You have the technology. And finally, all those cool features that you built into the ZV series for creators, go ahead and trickle this up. Us people using the A7S III need those things too. If you can't tell, I'm tired of all the new cameras just having higher frames per second, faster readout speeds, just more complex, more features. I want stuff we can actually use in the real world. And right now, there's really only one company that seems to be listening, and it's DJI. So consider them a threat. If you don't anticipate what people need and try to expand your audience beyond just people that look like me, the younger people are all going to adopt DJI because DJI is listening. They're ahead of you. Sony, Canon, Nikon, stop chasing each other and start looking at DJI and start looking at the smartphone market and see how you can fight back and take a piece of it. In the comments, let me know what you think. And don't forget to check out our sponsor, Squarespace, who has sponsored this channel for a full decade now. This entire studio was built by Squarespace, and we appreciate them. And you should too. Whatever business or personal project you're working on, head to squarespace.com/Tony and choose from their wide variety of gorgeous, professionally designed templates. Set something up, make it beautiful, and then you know what? You don't have to worry about it anymore. You don't have to be maintaining it, installing software updates, trying to make sure it works with the latest version of iOS. They take care of that. I've had websites that have gone almost unchanged for most of that decade, and they still function perfectly because the wizards at Squarespace take care of it for me. It all starts at squarespace.com/Tony, completely free trial, no credit card. Try it out. You'll love it. When you do, and you decide to sign up, the coupon code Tony will save you 10%. Thank you, and thank you, Squarespace. Happy New Year.